If we're going to answer the question, do we need corporations if the planet is going to feed itself, it's important to understand what it is that they have done to us so far. In Stuffed and Starved, there's a sort of diagram that is an hourglass figure. So I'm going to ask you to imagine an hourglass figure, something that's wide at the top, narrow in the middle, wide at the bottom. That's my PowerPoint right there. This hourglass figure, I want you to imagine at the top, there are the millions of farmers around the world who are growing food every day. At the bottom, there are the 7 billion of us who try to eat every day if we can. And in the middle, mediating between farmers and farm workers and consumers, are corporations. Now, in every major agricultural commodity, about 5 or 6 corporations control more than half of the global market. It depends on the commodity. I mean, 2 companies control the global market in tea, 6 companies control the global market in seed, 4 control the global market in grain. But whatever the commodity, there are 4, between 2 and 6 corporations that control more than half that market. Now, that's not an accident. That's something that actually that process of agricultural concentration of power has increased, and in particular it's been catalyzed by the Great Recession, where you've had moments where the price of competitors has fallen sufficiently for there to be a certain amount of cannibalism within the agribusiness sector, and the big have been getting bigger through the recession. The question is, well, are they helping? If you ask corporations, of course, you'll hear the answer, yes. They will advertise, their various sort of kinds of corporate social responsibility, and they will point to the fact that Greg Page, who is the CEO of Cargill, one of the big 4 grain trading companies, Greg Page says, we are producing more calories than ever before in human history. So they like to think that they're part of this calorie-producing engine. The awkward part comes when, if we're interested in feeding the world, we need to know how that food is distributed. And as I mentioned early on, we're not doing a good job of distributing because of the structure of the market. I mean, the reason that we have hunger today is not for an insufficiency of calories. And the corporations will admit this. The reason that we have hunger in the world today is because the way we distribute food is through the market. And when you distribute food through the market, you introduce 2 very simple rules. One, if you have money, you can eat, and that food can come from halfway around the world if it wants. And the other rule is, if you have no money, you will starve. And that's something that, again, it's important to have that sort of historical memory about how these global markets happen. How is it that we end up with a global hourglass? Well, we end up with the global hourglass through colonialism. And it's important to remember that, particularly as, again, just getting back to this Unilever thing, where David Cameron was talking about aid, and he was waving the flag and trying desperately to have some sort of legacy that's anything other than abominable. And he was saying, why is it that Britain is... Oh, I can't do the sort of smarminess, but imagine more smart. Why is it that Britain is out in front when it comes to aid? Well, it's because of the people we are. We do what is right. And it's very sort of self-congratulatory. Onanism, I think, is the term I'm looking for. He was wanking off in a very patriotic way, trying to point out that Britain are the kind of people who do the right thing. And what that does is erase the fact that for a very long time Britain did precisely the wrong thing. And if you look at the global market in food, one of the reasons we have the global market in food is because of British colonialism. And I'm using the work here of historian Mike Davis, whose book Late Victorian Holocausts is a must-read. It's not a great title, but it's a fantastic read. And he points out that at the beginning of the 1800s, India was fairly food self-sufficient, and the British came along and imposed markets in grain. And imposed markets in grain on an Indian feudal system. Feudalism, as you know, feudalism fairly crap. But basically you have a landlord and peasants, and the landlord makes the peasants work the land and then extracts the surplus from the peasants. And there's nothing good about that. But there's a silver lining, a moral economy when it comes to feudalism, which is that if there is a famine, if there is, the harvests fail, if something crappy happens, it's the landlord's responsibility to feed the peasant. That's feudalism. That's the moral economy of feudalism. And the British said, landlords, you don't want to be giving away free food. We have a much better system for you. It's called capitalism. It involves markets. Now, what you're going to do, you're going to pay your labourers, and then they will work for you. And then we, the British, will buy your grain. And it'll work out very well. You'll find that things are much more efficient. You'll produce more grain than ever before, and you'll be richer beyond your wildest dreams. And the landlord said, no thanks, we're fine. And the British said, no, we have guns. And so it was that feudalism was eradicated. I mean, that's an abbreviated history of colonialism, but you get the idea that it was through this, through violent imposition of markets that you have this global hourglass figure being set up, because the grain trading companies need the violent imposition of markets to be able to have this system. And the British didn't lie. By the end of the 19th century, India was exporting millions of tons of grain. More grain was being produced than ever before in Indian history. And so this efficiency argument is true. That when you compare to feudalism, capitalism can whip workers into high fervours of productivity because they need it in order to work in order to survive. But of course that's the downside, isn't it? That at the same time as India was exporting millions of tons of grain, workers were dying as they loaded the grain onto trains that were destined for Calcutta and then for here. And Mike Davis points out this horrific figure, which is, I think helps understand how it is that the corporations and the system in which they work, you can't just talk about corporations without understanding that they need to work within a market economy. You can't just pluck corporations out. You need to understand that they are dialectically related to the social conditions that they then aim to push. But before the British came to India, there was a famine once every 120 years. If you're a Doctor Who and you ended up visiting India in time of famine, you would have to come back 120 years later to catch the next one. But if you were in India after the British came, then you'd only need to wait 4 years between famines. And that's where, after India produces more food. So if we're interested in this question of, do we need corporations to feed the world? Well, the answer in 19th century India is clearly no. Because these corporations came along at the same time as massive famine. But today, our imaginations have been seized by these corporations. And I think one of the interesting places to look at how our imaginations have been sort of captured is in the supermarket. I mean, the supermarket is kind of exhibit A when you're thinking about progress in the food system, and you try and harken back to a time where you went to the co-op and there was one of everything on the shelves. It was kind of sort of Soviet model of what shopping was like before Tesco's and Sainsbury's came with their sort of vast cornucopias. And it's interesting that the minute you step into a supermarket, you're stepping into a machine that is designed to hijack you. A machine that is designed to make you consume more than you otherwise would. I mean, everything about supermarkets is sort of socially engineered. Everything from the fact that the milk is always at the back in supermarkets, right? I mean, that's not an accident. Even there is Whole Foods in the UK now, right? And they present themselves as the sort of champions of liberal do-goodery. But I mean, even there, the milk is always at the back. Why is the milk always at the back in a Whole Foods? Right, exactly. I mean, that's it. The milk is the one thing we're most often in supermarkets to buy, and so they have it way at the back because they know that there's a trail, a golden triangle between entrance, milk, and checkout. And along this triangle are goods that we are encouraged to purchase on impulse. Impulse, the opposite of choice, the opposite of freedom. Impulse is precisely that part of our psychologies that we don't have under control, that is not really rational, and we are being, our capacities of freedom and choice are being subverted because impulse is the opposite of choice. But these supermarkets exist, and they say, well, who else is going to bring your food from halfway around the world? And who else is going to provide innovation? We, the supermarkets, are in fact the reason why it is good to have a global food system. And it's certainly true that if you look at the sort of giants of the food system today, if you look at giant corporations, supermarkets are really some of the most important corporations in the food system. And Walmart, of course, is the world's largest grocer, but you have Tesco, of course, and Carrefour, and the European supermarkets close behind. And it's worth asking, well, what actually do supermarkets give us? Well, certainly they give us logistics. They give us this vast sort of empire being able to shuffle things around. They also give us marketing. They're absolutely, the structure of supermarkets, and it's not just the internal geography of a supermarket that is engineered. They are also very good at playing the right kind of music in supermarkets to make us consume more stuff. I don't know if you've noticed, there was a lot of money invested in supermarket music selections. You know, some people wondered whether it was a 1-2 cha-cha-cha that's going to help people buy more things, or is it a lilting sort of sonata, or is it a kind of Annie Lennox slash your wrists? And it turns out that Annie Lennox makes you buy more food. So it's one of the places you can reliably hear Annie Lennox is in a supermarket. But this is where the corporate investment is going. And I think that points to why it is that, again, we want to move away from this idea of corporations. Because they are in it very simply because of the rules of the game. The rules of the game are that if they don't return maximum value to shareholders, they will, the CEO will be out on their ear. And so if the CEO of Walmart, or the CEO of Monsanto, or the CEO of Archer Daniels Midland is not leaning very heavily on government in order to get tax breaks, in order to get subsidies, in order to be able to avoid paying for environmental damage, then that CEO is not doing their job. The rules of the game are pushing corporations towards the kinds of vast malfeasance that we see most clearly when it comes to oil. In the previous panel, we had a fairly clear sort of demonstration of quite how nasty the oil politics can get. But the structure of corporations themselves are designed, to, as I say, by the rules of the game, to maximize shareholder value. They are these greedy bastards. But again, they've succeeded in presenting us a world in which we believe that corporations are the only way in which change can happen. Because ultimately we are all greedy bastards. We are all selfish individuals. And of course that's not true. And I just wanted, how much longer do I have? Do I have like a couple of minutes? 10 minutes. Oh, we've got ages. Oh. In that case, I wanted to address that sort of pervasive myth of that we are purely selfish and greedy, and corporations are merely an extension of that. And to do that, I wanted to talk about the tragedy of the commons. Do people know about the tragedy of the commons? A few of you, some of you don't. Okay, so the tragedy of the commons was a thought experiment written in 1968 by a soil biologist called Garrett Hardin. And he said, essentially the model he had of the commons is this. Imagine now we're a village, the WDM village, and we are surrounded by a forest. And we are all selfish, greedy bastards, right? We are all these atomic individuals that sort of float around, governed by the laws of greed and selfishness. And so what do? Well, we depend on the forest, so we'll go down, we'll chop some trees, and we'll shoot squirrels and forage for nuts and berries, and we will progressively destroy the forest on which we depend, because we're selfish, and because nobody owns the forest, no one's going to stop us. And so we're going to carry on destroying the forest, and the tragedy comes that we know with eyes wide open we will destroy the resource on which we depend, and there'll be someone who knowingly will cut down the last tree and will do it anyway because they are selfish, helplessly so, selfish and greedy. Now, that model of how it is that we behave as these greedy bastards is wrong. If you look at the way if you look at sort of primate psychology, it's very clear that that as primates we are geared not to be selfish individuals, but to work collectively. If you look at the history of the commons in Britain or elsewhere, in England or elsewhere, there's a long history of people cooperating together. People, of course we're selfish, but we're also very good at following rules, and we're also very good at cooperating. We're not pure instruments of selfish greed. Corporations, on the other hand, are pure instruments of selfish greed. And to the extent that we believe that they are the only agents that are part of our salvation, and we heard it again and again at the Hunger Summit, that corporations have to be part of the solution. They must be part of the solution. And you heard that most of all from corporations. You heard David Cameron say it again and again as well. And you also heard some members of the IF campaign, which, if people want to talk about that, I think that would be an important thing to talk about. But the role of the corporation has been so hegemonic, it has so captured our imaginations that we can't imagine something different. So in the last couple of minutes, what I want to do is suggest that there are alternatives. One alternative that I think is very interesting was spawned by Friends of the Earth in Australia. And this is an alternative to a supermarket. If you think that the supermarket is kind of the Uber corporation when it comes to the food system, here's an alternative. And what they're doing, they admit that supermarkets are quite good at logistics. Walmart until recently had the world's second largest computer. after the NSA, where now the NSA has, as we know, many more computers, and there are a few other agencies in the US that have quite big computers too, but still, Walmart has massive computing power that it uses to figure out logistics. That they could tell that when a big hurricane was approaching Florida, that there would be an increase in demand for strawberry Pop-Tarts, because apparently that's what Floridians buy as their go-to apocalypse food. There are ways in which we can that you can open source some of the logistical software, and in fact, this group Friends of the Earth in Australia came up with something called Food Connect, where they figured out that there were farmers, that they wanted to have a logistical empire where people could effectively shop from different farmers around the country, or around their city, and pick it up in sort of local pickup points. And then they realized also that there were farmers who were getting too old to farm but still wanted the social community of farming. And so they were the farmers who were driving the trucks around, delivering and going backwards and forwards. And this has turned out to work pretty well in Melbourne, and quite well in Brisbane, and badly in Sydney so far, but apparently they're working on that. But that idea of using, that actually by investing in technology, you can come up with different ways of innovating, I think is very important. Because that's the other thing that corporations present themselves as guardians of, is innovation. That you won't have innovation if you don't allow corporations to patent things, and if you don't allow this sort of big empire of intellectual property. But again, what this open source food distribution shows is that actually innovation is, you don't need patents for innovation. In fact, patents can be inimical to innovation. Patents, again, are a product of a corporate system. There are other ways in which we can recognize and reward innovation. I'm not saying that innovation oughtn't to be recognized. But there are ways in which we can recognize innovation and make sure that innovators are celebrated without giving them monopoly patents for 30 years. And that's, again, one of the ways that Food Connect in Australia has done us proud.
I'm driven to be a devil's advocate to some extent. When it comes to food, there's a tremendous premium on efficiency of distribution. Not just for the obvious reason that food needs to be, or is desirable, food is eaten fresh, but also because the most telling statistic that I can quote is that during my lifetime, the world's population has more than doubled. I can remember when it was 3 billion. It's now well over 6 billion. I can also remember learning at school that there was only one city in the world with a population of 10 million, and that was Tokyo. We all know how urbanisation has changed the world, and rampant urbanisation is putting a greater and greater pressure on efficiency of distribution. I was interested, Raj, in your example of Food Connect in Australia. You said that it's been quite successful in Melbourne, not so successful in Sydney for some reason. Well, I can offer one or two reasons why that might be, because I'm familiar with Australian geography. Both these cities are cities of 3 to 4 million, so they, medium-sized cities by modern standards compared to Chinese cities, certainly. Melbourne is a city with a large, flat agricultural hinterland and an essentially flat urban area with long, straight routes radiating from the city centre. Sydney is much more like London. It's a mess, and it's also a much more geographically challenging city. But that's just as an aside. What I'd really like to know is what you think are the alternative, efficient solutions to the logistical expertise of the corporations to deliver food successfully. I just finished by one other example. Another situation I'm familiar with is Cuba. You don't have corporations in Cuba, essentially. You have the state, certainly as far as food distribution is concerned, and it's a disaster. A complete disaster. The ideal solution, farmers market, etc. Well, there are farmers markets there too, like we do here. They don't even touch 2% of the problem.
Thank you for that. Is there anyone else who's got a question? There's a hand waving. Great, thank you.
Yeah, Reinhard Hus, I'm working here at the university. I've got 2 questions and maybe also one comment about this Cuba. I mean, I'm also a bit skeptical, but Cuba has very good health indicators, and so it can't be such a big disaster because, I mean, I don't know whether you compare it with the availability of food in British supermarkets, but I mean, at least they seem to be able to feed their population. The 2 questions is actually what are we going to do? I mean, you said empowering farmers, so I mean, this sounds good, but how do you empower them? My question there is, would world citizens or basic income for everybody give them power, or what are the alternatives? And for corporations, should we get rid of them, or should we democratize them, turn them into co-ops, or what is the way forward? So these are the 2 questions. Thank you.
Getting to the idea of I don't know how to take this. Maybe let's start with corporations and how to reform them, because you know, in the United States we're fighting a big fight around corporate personhood, whether corporations can legally be people, and we've had a ruling from the Supreme Court saying that yes, they can. And that's has a lot to do with the way that our politics now is behooved. I mean, it's really beholden to corporations, no matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. So one might say, well, you know, reforming corporate personhood is a good idea, and we could we could look at Adam Smith. Adam Smith was deeply suspicious of corporations existing in perpetuity, where the incentives of the executives in a corporation were not aligned to those who owned stock. So, I mean, Adam Smith thought that the kind of corporations we have today were a bad idea as well. I mean, ways of getting things back into line to something that Adam Smith would approve of would be to time limit the charter of corporations and to insist that there were ways in which the executives were also people who suffered the consequences of their actions in one way or another. But even if you imagine even if we imagine just cooperativizing corporations, all of them, they now have to be co-ops somehow, they would still operate within the market that they have created. And so it's important not to fetishize the corporation, but to understand that it's a dialectical relation with the market itself. And we need to understand that the market today is something where corporations have managed to exist where they don't have to worry about paying social costs. They don't have to worry about environmental costs. And if we are to have just people getting together in organizations, which I think is a good thing, and working together, we need to have constraints that are socially agreed upon, and ways of setting prices that are socially agreed upon, and agreements on certain things that should belong in markets and things that don't. I mean, I think we can all agree people, slaves, do not belong in markets. But we're perfectly happy to say that some things should belong in markets. That clothes, for example, might want to belong in markets because you don't want the government telling you what to wear. But there has to be some way in which, if clothes end up in a market, they need to be, they need to be fair wages for all. A global minimum wage and a global maximum wage sound to me like a good idea. But again, the way you get there is through this sort of democratic sort of food sovereignty discussion around food and food prices. And again, it always comes back to this idea of efficiency and how to set a price. And one of the things, as you were saying, that the market has always been this contested place. One of the things that Via Campesina in India is very keen on, it's not just India, in the US as well, is setting a fair price for food. And by setting a fair price for food that's socially agreed upon, you can smooth out fluctuations and you can perform the insurance function that futures trading currently does. And by having a sort of socially agreed fair price for food, you actually end the process of food speculation, because futures contracts are just a way of saying, look, you're a farmer, you want to know what price you're going to get for something you grow this year, and a futures contract will lock in that price for you. Trouble is, if there's a catastrophic failure in harvests, you won't even get that because you have nothing to sell. So having certainly fair prices is important, but having a bigger social insurance mechanism is important too. And that's not something corporations can provide. So we need to have that discussion away from corporations, and we need to be able to have that's what a food sovereignty discussion would look like. Now, in terms of the future and in terms of Neil's provocations around Cuba and Sydney, I mean, I certainly think you're right. If you look at Cuba, it's the indicators for Cuba suggest that nobody is going hungry in Cuba. And I was there last year, and I saw obesity, and obesity is a problem in Cuba. But and of course, the quality of food in Cuba, it's like Britain in the 1970s. I mean, the things people eat in Cuba are very disappointing. It's some of the worst food you will ever eat. But there's not an insufficiency of it. And in fact, there's a lot of interesting agroecology that's happening in Cuba. People are not happy in Cuba with the government, but when it comes to hunger and when it comes to healthcare, people are poor, but they're not starving, not least in the ways that you see in the United States. But there is an interesting question around how it is that cities will feed themselves in the future, and I think that this is a question about efficiency that I think is really interesting, because corporations set themselves up as, that monoculture is a very efficient way of farming, but it's only efficient if you look at the numbers that they want you to look at. If you look at yields and you forget about environmental costs, if you look at the acreages, but you forget about the healthcare effects of consuming food in this way, or if you ignore the fact that the pesticides that are being used have long-term environmental and social consequences. So there was a report that came out a couple of years ago that I was very, very excited by, and it was a report looking at how it is that we will feed the world in 2050, when there are 9 billion people. And this is just a way of responding to the population question, without descending into crude Malthusianism. It's important to ask the question of how will 9 billion people eat in the future? And this report was called, and I commend it to your reading list, the International Agricultural Assessment on Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development, the IAA-STD. These people didn't go to acronym school, but it's a good report. I mean, these are 400 peer-reviewed, 400 scientists produced this peer-reviewed document looking at how people would eat in the future. And what they came up with was, look, actually, industrial agriculture is inefficient. We won't in the future have the cheap fossil fuels that are necessary to be able to grow food the way that we do today. The efficiencies of today's agriculture are a trick of cheap fossil fuels. Remove those fossil fuels and you're buggered. Similarly, with water, industrial agriculture requires an abundance of water. Remove that and you're in trouble. Industrial agriculture and monocropping requires constant climate. Remove a smooth, predictable seasons, and again you're in trouble. That's why polyculture is a much smarter way to go, because you have a portfolio rather than a single bet in your fields. And so what they're saying is, particularly in urban and peri-urban areas, we need more farms. We need to be thinking much more about rooftop gardens. We need to be thinking about urban and peri-urban agriculture. And that does mean rethinking how cities look and how cities are planned. And that would be an impossibly big thing to think about. But our modern cities are in many ways artifacts. I mean, I live 500 miles from Los Angeles. And I try to tell people in Los Angeles, look, imagine 50 years from now with the water footprint of Los Angeles and the way things look. Los Angeles won't be here. And people are like, no, that could never be. But 100 years ago, Los Angeles wasn't there either. Not in the same way. And the crises of agricultural inefficiency are an attempt, or a moment for us to get to reimagine not just food and food distribution, but urban architecture and urban planning and the way that our cities work. And you can see some of this already happening. You can see in Cuba, for example, that there is more urban and peri-urban agriculture that's agroecological and that is hurricane-proof. That they are, rather than using monocultures, they're using polycultures that are much more robust in terms of extreme climate change events. And that kind of thinking about urban space and urban planning is something that we need if we're going to get the more efficient future and one that's much more robust in terms of climate change. And again, corporations won't do that.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Okay.
Hi, Laura from London Group. So I'm sort of thinking of this question as I'm asking it, but I just wanted to know your sort of views on the argument between trying to maybe push the existing corporations into a system of markets that have been constrained and reformed to prioritise social interests. I'm thinking things like the Fair Trade Foundation, and also maybe if there was, a similar agro-ecological mark that could be attributed and that could be a target to go for, or do you think it's that's absolute nonsense and the best way to do is to just be really focusing on supporting sort of small-scale alternatives that will eventually, you believe will replace these corporations?
Thank you. I wanted to know if you both thought that anything good came out of the Hunger Summit, and if not, or if you have reservations about it, what kind of action would you suggest that we take now?
Hi, quite a straightforward question really. You mentioned briefly about means of regulating food speculation. If you could just briefly explain what have been put in place since your 2010 report and just demonstrate, evaluate how effective they've been so far. Thanks.
Yeah, the discussion began by making the point that there was plenty of food, the problem was distribution. The problem with distribution was that people didn't have enough money, but we managed to end up talking about the food system and the production of food as if that itself is a problem. So I'm just wondering, who is actually going hungry, where, and why?
Thanks so much. Fabulous questions all. In terms of who's going hungry, in general, I should have made this clearer in my PowerPoint presentation. The people at the top of the food pyramid, or this hourglass thing, are farm workers. They're the people who are most likely to be going hungry. And this is, of course, the deepest irony when it comes to issues around hunger, is that the people most likely to be dying of malnutrition, of undernutrition, are people who work in rural areas growing food. Farm workers, remember, are people who don't have access to farmland. They are too poor to be able to be farmers. And so they're dependent on wage work, and that's why they, when food is priced out of their reach, they will go hungry and they will die. That's the kind of acute end of hunger. But there's also psychologically and physically a very important level of just being food insecure, of not knowing where your next meal is coming from. That's a much bigger category. So when we say people are undernourished, and there are around 1 billion people who are undernourished, that's a much smaller number than the number of people who are food insecure. It doesn't include, for example, the 50 million people in the United States who are food insecure. But it is poor people around the world who are food insecure, and that also points to another issue that we need to address when we're thinking about the food system, which is that if we are going to have fair prices for food, we need to make sure that everyone is able to afford to eat. And again, that gets back to the thing we were talking about earlier on with slow food, is that the answer to problems in the food system is not more cheap food, which again is what corporations are offering, right? If you look at Michelle Obama in the United States wanting to solve the problem of food deserts, her solution is to have Walmart come in. Walmart, the famously gouging, low-wage work providing. If you're working at Walmart, you're usually on food stamps. In any case, you're on it's some sort of benefit to enable you to eat. That's not the solution. The solution is to make sure that everyone has a living wage. That's the solution to ending hunger right now. But we did get onto this bigger question around efficiency. And I mean, I don't think anything good came out of the Hunger Summit. I think that, and I was particularly worried by the extent to which some NGOs found themselves co-opted by the IF campaign, found themselves supine before the government, finding themselves cheering on for a program that is, as I say, is a way of deepening corporate power, particularly in Africa, facilitating land grabs, and not being aware that they're not listening to the voices of people in the global south who are coming out very loudly with alternatives that are inimical to the New Alliance for Nutrition. So, I mean, I would say that there are alternatives that we can support if only we wanted to. And I think that we should get behind some of those rather than signing up to government. I mean, I think it should be the role of the non-governmental, of civil society never to pair with government. But always to be in opposition, demanding better. Because what government is always in the business of doing is brokering compromises. Why compromise before when there's something we're fighting for that's much bigger than government is prepared to concede? So I think that it was very disappointing to see so many organizations in that space becoming, NGOs becoming GOs, or just plain O's. So that was a little sad. But in terms of tactics, fair trade, I wanted to I mean, I buy. I mean, here's the gag. I mean, I buy fair trade coffee because Because what's the alternative? Blood on your beans coffee? You know, I want coffee with the blood of small children. I want exploitation coffee. No, of course, you know, you buy fair trade coffee, it's the right thing to do. But is fair trade in and of itself going to transform the structures of the global economy? Well, no. So I'm perfectly happy for some people to fight for the juggernauts of these corporations to be moved a degree. But in the long run, I think that by the time that juggernaut gets to the other side, we'll have a different country in which they land. I mean, I think that there's there's only so much kind of reforming corporations that you can do. I had a lovely conversation with the head of corporate social responsibility at Unilever. He's a lovely man, and he's a very honest man, and his honesty makes him, and he puts it like this: if there's a win for Unilever and a win for the community, they'll do it. But if there's a win for Unilever and a loss for the community, they'll do it. And if there's a loss for the community, a win for the community and a loss for Unilever, it won't happen. And the trouble is that in that quadrant of win for the community but loss for Unilever is where most of the important stuff needs to happen. So I think that there's, if we're thinking about fair trade certification, I think that's okay, and I'm happy for that to be. If as a result of a tactical discussion, people are ready to say, fair trade stamp is a good thing. And as I say, I buy fair trade because at some sort of nominal consumer level, I think that's important. But I think that the work that we need to do, particularly as WDM, is a much more radical kind of work than providing the new label that, when you go into the shop, you make sure now that it's organic and fair trade and dolphin friendly and tuna compatible, and another label is going to make you feel that bit, that bit less guilty. But it's not going to. I mean, I think at the margins it makes a difference. But we're interested in bigger margins than that, I think.